Welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo. I'm the founding partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory firm that's focused on addressing Africa's most complex development challenges. Today's episode is titled Cracks in the Republic, Inside West Africa's Political Operating System. We're asking a very blunt question. If democracy has returned to the region, why is it that so many citizens experience the state as an extractive rather than a service to them? And why is the region once again flirting with coups and constitutional erosion? My guest argues that what looks like chaos is often a system, a web of elite networks, informal transactions, and unwritten rules that can absorb democratic forms while producing systemic failure. We'll treat corruption not as a scandal on the surface, but as something closer to an operating system, and ask why West Africa arrived at this equilibrium and what would have to change for democracy to deliver development. We'll go from probably the 1990s rupture that shaped Nigeria's Fourth Republic to the everyday political economy faced by small businesses and the everyday man, to the regional moments, these coups backsliding into military rule and the weakening of external democracy pressures. And probably would end where most serious conversations should end, with what is a realistic, reformable option and what should give us hope. Matthew T. Page is an associate fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House and the co-author of Nigeria, What Everyone Needs to Know. For 14 years, he served as the U.S. intelligence community's top Nigeria expert, with roles across the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the National Intelligence Council, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, and also the U.S. Marine Corps. He has also been a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment and is an alumnus of the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship. His work spans corruption taxonomy, security vote politics, and everyday struggles of small and medium-scale enterprises. And he has a forthcoming book, which we are eagerly awaiting, Understanding Kleptocracy. Matthew, welcome.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you so much for having me. As I mentioned before, we all came together to you privately. This has been a long time wish of mine is to feature on development discourse. I've found these sessions so enlightening, and I feel very grateful for being invited on to speak with you today. So thank you again for having me, and to the whole team at Next Year, which is really an excellent group of people who over many years I've had an enormous respect for, both individually and collectively, in terms of the work that you're doing.
No, you're so kind. Thank you so much. So in your writings, you've argued that Nigeria, and probably by extension West Africa, is not chaotic so much as governed by a set of unwritten rules. Can you unpack that for us? What are some of these core rules of the game, and how do they work in practice?
Yeah, no, this makes me think back almost 25 years ago now, when I was a young lad first starting out studying Nigeria and really focusing on it every day in and day out. And I ran into a Ghanaian friend who was asking me how things were going, and I said to him, "Oh, it's great. I'm working on Nigeria. I'm going to be traveling there a lot." And he just sort of laughed and said, "Nigeria, that place is crazy." He, he just laughed, and I thought, "Oh my goodness, what am I getting into?" Is this area of study, area of focus, one that I'm ever going to get my head around? But
Mm,
I quickly learned that sort of what looks like this incredibly dynamic, ever-changing, difficult to comprehend universe of its own, right? That we often think of Nigeria almost as its own separate planet within a
mm,
planet, really, in terms of how it functions, both in terms of its governance and its society, and just day-to-day life. What I realized, very quickly is again there are these systems and structures in place, especially within the political economy of the country, that really shape how things operate day to day.
mm.
And what's also interesting, and you'll appreciate this again, is as we were talking about earlier, someone who really came of age during the military period and became
Exactly.
politically enlightened during that period, that there are so many linkages back to that period and so
Mm,
much continuity and and again, so many of these big themes or big operating principles that continue on within the country. So my pitch to people now, when they say, "Oh my goodness, what's going on in Nigeria?" is I say, really try not to, try to separate the signal from the noise, as Nate Silver says. You need to look deeper and really wrap your head around sort of these unwritten rules of the game and understand, at least in one context, right, in terms of the political system, that Nigeria is actually uh, a very highly evolved, very sophisticated, complex, diversified um, system
mhm,
where, as we said, sort of private gain over public good is one of the main operating principles of the system.
mm, mm. And we're not going to focus too much on that Ghanaian friend. They can't get over the fact we've got better jollof than they do. So
Absolutely. And
they're
better
always trying to put
football.
us
Yeah.
down. Yeah, better football, better everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
But seriously, let's discuss pathways, right?
Mhm.
Given West Africa's modern history, why did we arrive at this type of political economy rather than, say, a bureaucratic, developmental system? What were the key forks in the road in our modern history that you believe probably led us down this path?
Wow, I think the answer to that question would be an amazing PhD thesis or something, or like a book. It makes me think of, Max Siolan's
Yeah,
books, where really
all of them. Yeah.
all of them,
Yeah.
and again, he's sort of, it's almost like he's like Tolkien. He's written these, written the first three, and then he's written prequels and sequels to those books that really focus on military rule. And for me,
Mhm.
those books were indispensable in helping me to understand just what you're talking about, those junctures in the road, the real interplay between, because it was an interplay between civilian political development and military rule. We often think uh, erroneously that, there were sort of these periods when civilian rule was suspended and then military rule came in and then civilian rule was restored, where in fact the real picture is much muddier. There were always civilian networks behind the scenes being instrumentalized by military leaders and vice versa. Uh,
Mhm.
and of course, as we all know, in the levels below the military rulers during the time that they dominated the Nigerian, let's say, political scene, governance scene,
Mhm.
they relied essentially on a real deep reservoir of civilians that supported that system. And so
Mhm.
rather than looking at sort of civilian politics in Nigeria and military politics, um, as distinct, sort of one stopped and another began. In reality, they're just so closely intertwined, and they're really sort of the two heads of the same beast in
Mhm.
in so many ways. And we can talk in more detail about the continuities of military rule post 1999. I think they're really interesting and very, very, very relevant to how governance in Nigeria has evolved and why it's, as we've said, sort of become dysfunctional. Um, but I would say that pattern is very clear, and I would also say that that pattern also carries over into some of these other countries,
Hmm.
in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, especially Niger Republic. These are systems where, again, there's actually more overlap sometimes between those maybe civilian political interests and military rulers than we think.
Yeah. I mean, and even beyond the more overt, where you see that past military presidents or heads of states become democratic presidents,
Right.
even Senate presidents, ministers, even beyond all of that, you can even see the culture we've adopted in our democracy. If you take the security space, for instance, the fact, and you've done a lot of work in this, security votes, etc., the fact that we are still operating some of those secretive military forms of governance, even in a democratic system where we should be more open, shows this interplay between what are military structures and what should be democratic structures, but do indeed behave more like military structures.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The incredible amount of continuity between the military period and the post 1999 civil, the Fourth Republic is really something that is, as I said, very clear and also incredibly relevant for understanding this big question that you've put out there, right? Which is, why is the system not delivering?
Hmm.
And I think, that sense that existed during military rule of military exceptionalism,
Hmm.
obviously in those days non-existent civilian oversight, but now very weak civilian oversight, both of the military and then also of government decision making. Spending, of course, is the big issue. Because again, I think Nigerian governance is still really much more focused on just spending decisions rather than policy decisions. You probably find this too, not to get on a tangent, but I'm sure sometimes, clients or just, outsiders come to you and say, well, what's the Nigerian government's policy on this, that, or the other? And as I always say to them, there is no policy, and really, until their arms are twisted or they're forced to come up with one.
Yeah.
It's not a policy driven or ideas driven or ideology even. I
Hmm.
mean, again, that's sort of the basest form of how regimes are driven. It's in a sense it's very pragmatic, but it's really
Hmm.
just driven, as we know, about splitting up the national cake. And I love
Exactly.
that. I love that sort of image. Um, but
Exactly.
but before we leave at that point about sort of excessive secrecy, as I said, military exceptionalism, this notion of impunity that both the military and the police, the security agencies, whether it be the DSS or what have you, but also political elites writ large, sort of have this license to kill, right? This sort of James Bond 007 sense of impunity in terms of their actions. I think that really dates back to military rule and was deliberately kept, by people, let's name them, by people like Obasanjo, people who were very key in shaping the post 1999 transition. And, rightly or wrongly, they felt that continuity would help, bridge that divide between military and civilian rule among the elite classes. And I
Hmm.
think the problem is we've not really evolved beyond that. Ironically, I think you could make the argument that at least in his first term, Obasanjo was sort of the most liberal with a small L, of all the presidents or the ruling dispensations you've had in Nigeria thus far.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting character, and I'm sure we're going to mention him a few more times in this conversation. But let me touch on something that is quite insightful in your work. You talk about a detribalized elite in Nigeria benefiting from this operating system. How does this square with the very popular narratives that most, if not all, decisions, political decisions in Nigeria and the region are driven to a large extent by these ethnic considerations. But you've shown that this elite are also quite tribalized. How does that square?
Yeah, it is a bit what's the word, counterintuitive, that you have an elite, and we all know this to be true, right? I mean, it's not news that I'm saying that sort of among the elite, right, you have people from across religious and ethnic divides, who again share a common purpose, which is enriching themselves off the backs of everyday Nigerians
Mm,
through the mechanism of governance and politics. And so they share almost everything in common, right? Except perhaps not notionally, what local government area they come from. But their
mhm,
ties to their place, right, are generally speaking very, very weak, right? And that's why I love, these phrases you get in Nigerian politics, that person is an Abuja politician, that person, is not a grassroots guy, that person can't even show his face in his village anymore, type of thing. These are narratives that we hear in political discourse that point to that, not just detribalization, but sort of de-anchoring or disconnection from the people that they are in theory representing, or that whose interests they serve. And what we also see is, as you say, like a sort of injection of tribalism, you know, and again, it's not so much tribalism sometimes as it is just sort of grassroots demands and oppositional demands about sharing local resources, because the elites and how the system worked has kept the grassroots on the back foot for so long,
mhm.
right? So the appeals that come up from the grassroots to essentially try to um, motivate or draw attention to their elites, or to get a greater share of those resources, a bigger slice of the national cake at the local government or state government. Those are often pitched either formally or sometimes just, you know, in an unspoken way, in sort of tribal or religious terms. Meanwhile, of course, the elites are all holidaying in Dubai. They all sort of live in the same tower block in Dubai, and have drinks in the, governor's penthouse there and so forth. I mean, again, I've done the research on the property ownership in Dubai by
Yeah.
Nigerian elites. And one of the amazing findings that surprised me was that the ownership was completely detribalized. You had as many, political figures from the north as from the south, the east and the west. It didn't, there wasn't some sort of strong northern Muslim bias for property ownership in Dubai, or vice versa, some sort of strong, southwest or southeast property ownership in London. Again, everybody everywhere. It's only in Nigeria that those fault lines are maintained for political gain by the elites.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's the point. I guess that's the point I'm trying to get at, that what is presented as ethnicity, tribalism, or even extending prebends to co-ethnics or co-religionists, is probably not real, right? But more what is sold to the masses to retain the elite in power. That they meet as one, they are friends. When there's money to be shared, there's no ethnicity. Where there's opportunity to be accessed, none of that. But when there is politics, which is coming up in another few months, all of the messaging, both overt and subtle, will be around ethnic divides and a religious divide. But in essence, those things do not really exist. Would that be a fair conclusion?
Yeah, or they exist, but they're somewhat of a or they're exacerbated, they're intensified for political purposes. I mean, something you'll know, and those who are on the call who really, are just very deep into, the ins and outs of Nigerian politics is how much intermarriage, right, and these family linkages matter between different regions. Some of the most important elites in Nigeria, have married and sort of built networks far beyond their region. You even look at like someone like Tinubu, who over the course of his political career, starting very early, developed nationwide structures which he maintained over the long term. You look at someone like Atiku Abubakar, who from a very early period had a major footprint in like River State, right, through his business interests there and in the Niger Delta. So that's where you get these almost sometimes they're binary, sometimes they're multipolar connections within elite circles that are that are never quite fully appreciated until you get really down in the weeds, and it's like I don't know, looking at a premiership team and really starting to look at the background and skills of each of the individual players and realizing how they function as a team so effectively. The problem, of
Mm,
course, in the Nigerian context is these teams, this team of elites, they're not playing to win sort of development, greater delivery of public services and stuff. They're playing to win private gain to themselves. Now there are public goods delivered in the process, and we can talk about why there are political reasons to deliver some, but not all, the possible public goods to sort of perpetuate one's hold on power and to perpetuate one's legitimacy and to fight off challengers, who, because of this notion of power rotation and federal character, are going to agitate to displace elites who have been sort of sitting on the throne for too long. But for the most part, the lion's share of Nigeria's wealth and resources and everything are actually being distributed across these elite networks
mhm.
that are very wide, they're very deep, and they do trickle down. So that in a sense is relevant as well. But it is really the fundamental principle of the operating system. Again, the system isn't broken; it's working perfectly for the people who design and operate it.
Exactly. And we're going to get to some of those points you mentioned, but I want to talk about this idea of government as theater, where
Mhm.
the structures are set up in form, but not in function. What I suspect that Nigerians know this, so Nigerians know that we go to elections, we vote, we go through all the rituals, but that doesn't really say that it's a democracy. My challenge is if we see this theater, why do we seem quite powerless to call time on it? And why aren't we able to, as a people, rise as one to say enough of the theater and time to begin to develop the country?
Yeah, and I think that gets into sort of well, I think we'll probably get there at the end in terms of talking about the solutions, the collective action problem that again I think Nigerians have, but I wouldn't put it all on the backs of the people who are just trying to get their kids to school on time and make sure they can afford to pay their school fees and taking care of elderly parents who can't provide for themselves. Those are the people essentially who don't have the bandwidth to take on the system. But as you said, the theater, the governance theater, the illusions of reform are really there. It's this sort of, people will remember the story about the Potemkin villages in right? Was it in Tsarist Russia where they, when the Tsar would go through these villages, they would build, fake frontages on the villages to make them seem less poor and destitute for the benefit of the Tsar. So really what we have in Nigeria, of course, and this is just a constant theme. We see it if you read the headlines on Premium Times or what have you. They just jump out at you, right? It's all this sort of make believe, going through the motions of governance and
Mhm.
the provision or policy or the provision of public goods. And I think there are a few reasons. Well, I think one of the main reasons is despite their corruption and self penchant for self enrichment, what I call kleptocracy, ultra corrupt governance in my book, and explain what that entails. But let's say, again, as a stand-in word for this operating system, let's call it kleptocracy in
Mhm.
Nigeria. It These kleptocrats still crave legitimacy. They still want to, not have, rotten vegetables thrown at their cars when they eventually do come home to the village, right? They want to be they're egotists, they want to be loved, they want to be appreciated. And that's why they create these patronage networks
Mhm.
as much to um obviously perpetuate their hold on power, but also because they want the sort of social benefits, right?
Mhm.
The social assets as well as the financial assets of being in power. So that's one part. Also, over the years, right, foreign engagement in Nigeria, international engagement, whether that be the UK, the US, Commonwealth nations, right, who especially post 1999 really have put a great degree of scrutiny and pressure on Nigerian elites to, you know, move push the development of democracy forward. This theater also is put on for their benefit as well, and
Mhm.
for again justifying the continuation of the status quo. Um, but what we've gotten out of it, right, is the creation of structure with no substance. And
Mhm.
everybody, who's Nigerian on this call will know the term white elephant, the white elephant projects, where again, government spending with no business case, no real end in sight, no plan, the whether it be the Port Harcourt monorail, I mean, the list is endless. Someday I want to make a giant coffee table book of all the Nigerian white elephant projects. I mean, I joke about it, but obviously the sad thing about all those white elephants going back, 50, 60 years is that those are funds that could have been deployed to make Nigeria develop in a more sustainable, rational way. Um, and instead what we have is universities with no investment. We have clinics with no nurses, schools with no teachers. So there's this creation almost of a husk of a state that is in many ways functioning as a Potemkin village.
Sure.
And that really needs to change, right? So what we need going forward is governance with substance and move away from the play acting. Now, the one last thing I would say on this point is that, and we talked about a lot about this a lot when I worked at the State Department, and we would talk about you know democracy and development and governance in Nigeria, and we would lament this phenomenon. But the point that was always made, and I think there's validity to it, is the alternative to the theater or the form, but not the substance, is no form, right?
Mm.
So in a way, is play acting democracy or play acting good governance, is that essentially a step along the path towards actual democracy and actual good governance? And I think the answer, and you can argue in a more deliberate way, that yes, that is true. However, the problem is that here we are in 2026. You and I have been watching this since 1999, if not before, and we've not moved beyond the play acting of democracy and the governance theater to to real governance. In fact, you could
Mhm.
argue that the times that we've verged into it, we've probably regressed more recently away from it.
Mhm. Mhm. So so your question therefore is what's the political cost, and where would it come from? If in the past, and you alluded to it, there was some of the play acting was for our international development partners because there was an America as the international liberal democracy police. That space has been exited.
Yeah.
It appears that today what we have is a rise in nativism, a rise in the strongman politician, and that what we have in Nigeria will play into that mode. So if this vacuum tends to exist, if the system seems to be more fertile for the type of play acting that we do here, where would the pressure come from to force for us to move beyond form to function?
Yeah, that's a really good question and one that I've thought a lot about. And I've come, partially to the place that it's going to come from, and I don't like the term necessarily middle class, but it's going to be coming from Nigerians who have moved out of sort of subsistence living, living hand to mouth. I think that, like in any society, any country around the world, people who are living hand to mouth, are just focused on putting one foot in front of the other day to day. They obviously are also susceptible to being pulled into more desperate, um, forms of whether it be like an insurgency or, criminal activity, or even, being forced into some sort of humanitarian refugee situation, right? We know all the different sort of outlets that those people can be pulled into. But I think, um, for for Nigeria, the pathway towards whether it be demands for better governance, the actual push for better governance will be from people again who are realizing that what little they've been able to build for themselves in terms of an education, a house, right, maybe in a suburb of Abuja or Lagos, a business, um, maybe a business that again relies on trading across Nigeria or beyond. That what they require are very basic public goods that the state is not providing. And I think that, we are well on our way towards that development, with that tipping point where, again, it's not affluent Nigerians, but Nigerians who need government either to, provide those basic public goods or at least sort of stay out of the way and not be a disruptive factor in their day-to-day lives, threaten that essentially those workaround solutions that they have developed in order um, to not be dependent on the
Mhm.
government or not be dependent on the state. Often
Mhm.
I talk about, and again, I apologize to everyone if this sounds sort of um, you know, uh, unfair, but I talk about Nigeria as sort of a pre-post-apocalyptic state, right? In the sense that if you imagine a state, where the government falls apart and doesn't provide public goods, but then people sort of just band together in their communities, or they create their own walled compound with a borehole, and the schools are failing, so private schools spring up, and that in a sense is what's already happened in Nigeria. The goal of most people, and again, Patrick, tell me if I'm wrong, just from your own personal experiences, most people are just trying to avoid structuring their life, building a life where government can't mess it up.
Yeah.
Um, and some people have chosen a different path. Some people have sort of weighed the costs and benefits and have said, "Well, I'm going to get in on the game. I'm going to, you know, try to wangle that government job, or I'm going to, be a part of this patronage network. I'm going to hitch my wagon to someone within that part of the system." But as you and
Mhm.
I know, there are millions more Nigerians who say, I'm just going to steer well clear of that. And that's especially true, right, in places like Lagos, where for
Mm.
decades, government has essentially been almost one of the least lucrative, right? If you live in Gombe State or you live in Kebbi State, as they say, those are civil service states.
Yeah.
You know, government is the biggest business in town. But if you live in Lagos, the prospect for finding wealth, success, happiness, prosperity, security, those pathways are far wider and far smoother outside of
Outside government. Hmm. Hmm.
so that's my so to sort of pull that all together, I guess what I would say is, where, you know, as the rest of Nigeria essentially becomes more like Lagos in that specific sense,
Hmm.
where sort of being separated from government, keeping it at an arm's length,
Hmm.
insulating yourself from government sort of becomes the pathway to prosperity and security. Then Nigeria will essentially, as a state, develop a healthier relationship with its government, and this will disempower elites
Hmm.
in the context. They will need to adapt, and they will adapt. I believe they're very adaptable and opportunistic, so they will come round to the realities of the new system.
Fantastic. Let's come back to this question on democracy in the age of coups. So coups are back in the region. In fact, even in Nigeria, we've had rumors of coups. You know, the the points are neither here nor there. Some people think it's a mirage, some think it's real. But the fact is that we're beginning to talk about, the C word that we thought was already, expunged from our lexicon. Does this suggest in any way some sense of path dependency? Just an underlying vulnerability in our governance framework that keeps pulling us back to this very illiberal form of governance. Does it mean that we are inherently martial, or is it simply what happens when civilian systems fail to deliver? Is there something intrinsically martial in our outlook, or is it just that the systems tend to fail and pull us back to coups and military government?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think any of us who, think, and breathe and dream about Nigeria, Nigerian history, day to day, we think about this a lot. What I would remind all of us, of course, is that it's been 27 years, right?
Hmm.
Since Nigeria transitioned away from military rule.
Hmm.
We forget it just how if we go back and look at the alternations, um, whether it be the very short-lived Second Republic, the even shorter-lived Third Republic, uh, the time span now is just multiples greater, and multiples greater as well. It's sort of exponentially so because of the dynamism and complexity of our modern, right? Time has accelerated, the pace of change has accelerated so greatly. And so, um, you know, I think maybe we're caught up in a bit of a, what's the word? We have this hang up, or we have, like we have this PTSD from the period of military rule where we think it's hiding under the bed and it's going to come back.
Yep.
Now, I think that it's fair to say that any country, I mean, look at what's happening in the United States right now, is subject to democratic backsliding, subject to the rise of authoritarian rule, the sort of suspension of norms in terms of how the citizens are treated by their security forces, the tribalization of the security forces, and so forth. I think, though, that um, Nigeria even more. And this is something that other scholars have said ad infinitum, is that of course, carrying off a coup in Nigeria today versus in 1993 or 1983, these are, it's night and day, the level of complexity and difficulty in executing that. Um, I also think, and I've said this for a long time, that one of the things Obasanjo succeeded in doing was sort of bureaucratizing the military, and rather than and sort of flipping the tables, partially because he was a retired general, and so many of the other civilian politicians post 1999, the G77, all those guys, were retired generals or had those linkages to those families. They sort of flipped the script on the military dictatorship by, rather than the military co-opting civilians, the civilians co-opted the military. And so now, here we are where um, I would think that we're getting to the point where there are very few military officers left who actually were in the military before 1999, right? I mean, if you're at the 27, year mark in your career, maybe you were at the NDA starting in 19, class of 95. Again, I used to know this stuff, but suffice it to say, we're getting to the point where we do not have this essentially cohort of senior officers who were lieutenants and captains, during the Abacha period or what have you. Whereas for a long time we did.
But
So the
sorry to cut in, Matthew, but
No, 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 please.
I think the premise here is that you needed to have been part of that cohort to be able to execute a coup. But what we may be missing in the conversation is that the conditions that led to those coups back then may be prevalent today, which is
Yes.
this dissatisfaction with the political class, people feeling that what you've got is a predatory elite that does not care about them. And then you look at some of the Afrobarometer data that shows that younger Africans, when you poll them, they're all saying that, would rather let's try something else. Democracy isn't working. And, with the military, it's a smaller group of people who will be chopping versus this
Yeah.
large, political class. So I don't think that you had to be part of that school, that cohort. And I think that we're actually playing with fire.
No, I 100% agree. Absolutely. As you say, I mean, if anything, you could make the argument that officers who were not a part of that period of military rule sort of thinks it's easy, oh, it's
Mhm.
novel. It's, they won't necessarily remember, you know, how the military itself really, lost its professionalism in many ways
Mhm.
during that period of military rule because they became pencil pushers.
Mhm.
You had, I don't know, captains and colonels serving as military governors. Yes, they became very rich, but they sort of, these were not war fighters or people
Exactly.
who, were defending the country.
Mhm.
They were just bureaucrats basically in
Mhm.
uniform.
Mhm.
So I absolutely agree. And I think the issue that you highlighted of this demand signal, is there a popular demand signal being telegraphed from the Nigerian people for sort of this kind of like you read about Russians, pining for Soviet rule, is there um, this desire to head back to that period? I think you could argue that the election of Buhari in 2015, right? And if you say, well, 2015 was, by and large, one of the freer and fairer, actual, voting exercises that Nigeria's had, 2011 and 2015, you could
Mhm.
argue that the sort of clear popular interest in having Buhari return expressed that demand signal for sort of a return to de facto, if not de jure, military rule.
Yeah.
And we know also that under Buhari, those patronage networks contracted significantly. And they've since widened out again in
Mhm.
2023, back in sort of a good luck Jonathan, sort of Obasanjo-esque type of way. Um, so there may be. I mean, again, I don't know, and I don't think necessarily Nigerians are thinking, in these terms, but I think they perhaps after the Buhari experience, 8 years of really him, let's be honest, driving the economy onto the rails and taking a more authoritarian approach to political rule, maybe there isn't that desire, and maybe there's a desire more, as we talked about earlier, to sort of wait and see, sort of take this fatalistic, well, in a few years we'll have another spin at the wheel and see if someone
Mm-hmm.
comes in who's better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, that would be my sense. But I
Sure.
may be wrong. I may be wrong. I just don't see that popular demand signal like there was maybe in Burkina or even Niger or what have you, to sort of bring the military in to put things right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So one of the main issues we're dealing with in the country today is a slow but steady drift to a one-party state. I think at last count, about 30 state governors have, are now with the All Progressives Congress, APC. I think about 75 or maybe even 80 senators are in that camp. And it's looking like we are becoming a one-party state. Question is it really a bad thing to be a one-party state? Um, doesn't it signal some kind of our form of democratic maturation, evolution? And are there structures and systems that could lead to, that could make such a system deliver development more than the governance theater of multi-party democracy?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I'm thinking back to all those, African Studies Association, conferences I went to over the years where you had these smart political scientists who could bring the data and show you, how one party rule versus delivered public goods. I mean, there's a whole, again, field of people. I'm just sort of a talking head when it comes to these issues, but there are people who really do understand the correlations within a West African context, not, and then globally as well, in terms
Mm,
of what can be delivered. I mean, we certainly have a lot of one-party states or even just really dynastic states. Look next door in Cameroon, right, where
mm.
you've had one-party rule, or places like Gabon before the coup and so forth. Vice,
Rwanda for a better example.
pardon me?
Rwanda could be a
Rwanda,
better
yeah.
example of where it's delivered some development.
Exactly, exactly. And so, right. So you have Rwanda, obviously, sort of what I think of as like this semi-benevolent dictatorship, right? Um, or like a Ghana, where you've had real alternation between parties,
Mm-hmm.
where again, there are some sort of regional, bases to those parties, but also there's sort of a swing vote, right? Almost like in an American sense that does sort of switch party affiliation to deliver victory,
Mm-hmm.
based on performance.
Mm-hmm.
And so really what it comes down to, right, is performance. And I don't think, and again, I'm not the political science expert, but I don't think there's a strong correlation necessarily between, performance in the context that we're looking at between one party and multi-party. And I think the example of that, of course, within the Nigerian context is looking back over, previous senates, and House of Representatives, the whatever the seventh, eighth, ninth, I can't even remember what number we're on now, right? But looking at the division or looking at the breakdown between governors, and I think part of that is, and I'm not saying anything that anyone will surprise anyone here, is that of course, you know, party affiliation is such a weak designator in Nigeria, and what is more significant is, right, the sort of party in power and the party out of power. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one that distinguishes politicians at both the state and national level, the federal level. And what we've seen, of course, in recent years is a splintering of the opposition, you know, certainly um, with Tinubu at the helm, you have to give him a lot of credit for not just keeping the APC together, a very, very big tent now where people are really just sort of, falling out of the edges, right? They're just sort of they're almost everyone is in that tent now,
Mhm.
um, or they are trying to get in,
Mhm.
and and so the there's two factors at play, right? Is that weakening, splintering of the opposition, their failure, they've sort of run out of petrol, really. They've run out of
Exactly.
steam. Um, Part of it is just being out of power for so long and sort of, just whatever campaign war chests they'd accumulated from being in power is, have
Depleted.
been
Mhm.
depleted. Yeah, exactly. Whereas that was not the case earlier.
Mhm.
I think also, again, as the political elite has expanded and become more dynamic and more cutthroat in a sense and competitive, since 1999, the volume of people now who are prior office holders who feel like they have a fighting chance to get in on the action has expanded. And so, you know, the I'm sure, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure it costs more now to, win a state House of Assembly seat than it did in, 2001.
Exactly.
That type of thing. The cost of politics, which the Westminster Foundation, has done some really good research on. The cost of politics in Nigeria and so forth has really increased to such a degree that it has both invited a lot of competition into the space, but also really raised the bar for entry. And so, in order to stay in office or have a chance in staying in office, you need to somehow get back into the ruling party. So again, I think it all comes down to incentives and disincentives. But the last thing I would say on this is what we do know is it's kind of like a red giant, right? Let's use this astronomy analogy here, where a sun grows so big, so warm that then, someday it explodes. And we
Mhm.
saw that to some extent in 2013 with the creation of the APC. I mean, it wasn't, I don't think it's quite a perfect parallel by any means, but where the APC ultimately is heading, of course, is potentially just real difficulty keeping that one party state together because Nigerian politics is not that monolithic.
Mhm.
And there is still this federal system with a lot of subdivisions within the country. It's not a Gabon, it's not a Cameroon. You need there's always going to be this competition, and at some point, it's going to be difficult to regulate, and those factions are going to split apart. And this time, because they've been in the ruling party for a long time, the players in those factions will have the what's the word? The pile of cash in the back room, the means to then strike out on their own and try their luck.
So I used to think that, but I think I'm challenging that thought because
Okay.
if we go back to the initial premise that we really don't have these ethnic divides and religious divides as the headlines tend to present, that we have kind of an elite class that is bound by their interest in privatizing public wealth, and they're guided by that philosophy, and it's core to who they've become. If you have all of them within a single party, they may figure out how to share within that single party that 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 suggests that it may survive, versus if you take the assumption that we have the ethnic divides and the fracture points, etc. So my thinking is that this could be an interesting experiment that we're beginning to see of bring everybody within the party, and the fighting happens within the party. The fighting
Mm.
for access, for control of resources, etc., happens. I'm not advocating that it's the best thing for Nigeria. What I'm saying is that it could be where we're going, and that the fracture that one would have thought would happen, given our understanding of ethnic and religious divides, may not happen if our initial premise that this is just a bunch of guys who figured out how to privatize our commonwealth, that they will figure out how to stay in power by figuring out how to divide and hold it together. Am I off the mark completely?
No, no. I mean, I like this vision. The one thing I'll say, and you'll laugh, is that these guys just their personalities are too big. They all want to be the Oga at the top,
Mm.
and so the system you describe, right, has occurred. And in my Understanding Kleptocracy book, I talk about these, what we're talking about ultimately is like contestation,
Mm-hmm.
so you know, are these kleptocratic networks, fighting, constantly sort of jockeying with each other for dominance, or are they much more cronyist where you have maybe a group of people at the top or one person at the top, sort of a Paul Biya, you know,
Mm-hmm.
or a foreign Nasingbe in Togo, you know Idris Deby before he died, in Chad, who are handing out, and making sure that everybody gets a little piece of the pie. I think
Mm-hmm.
Tinubu, like I said, has played that role effectively. The problem is that again, Tinubu will not be on that perch forever. I mean, no one can be in the limelight or in that position of authority forever. And so at some point, that contestation that I think naturally exists within the Nigerian system bubbles to the fore. And I think part of the reason here, again, going back to sort of like the political economy of politics or the incentives and disincentives is, right now the elite networks are very large and the APC is very large. That means everybody essentially is getting a smaller piece of the pie. And so there's always going to be a drive, right, within the party to sort of try their luck to just, break away in a large enough segment like the APC did in 2013 to capture the political high ground and then not have to share it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then get to decide again to repeat the process, decide, lure people back into the tent once they're hungry and obedient enough to take what they're willing to be given. I
Yeah.
think it's a more utopian, what you describe as a more not necessarily utopian model, but a more distributive, centrally, almost like a kind of like a communist, model where, everybody gets a little piece, everybody has to be happy with it. And the problem with the Nigerian political class is they're too ambitious, they're too dynamic, they're too like I said, they want to be the Oga. They don't
Yeah.
want to necessarily, be the small boy in the room.
Yeah. I mean, what I was thinking about the CCP, and how it evolved from, competitive politics to what it is today. Although what is missing in Nigeria is that binding philosophy.
Right.
Uh, but whatever. Okay, so maybe get another question in before I turn over to audience participation. And let me, just ask anyone who wants to ask a question to please post it in the Q&A tab, and I'll pick it up from there and give appropriate attribution to the person who posted the question. But Matthew, one of the institutions that you've, really spent some time studying is the EFCC, ICPC as well. And my question is around how did they become like this? We can't imagine that the current EFCC is the EFCC that Nuhu Ribadu started out before Obasanjo and the political interference. What is it about the EFCC that made it lose its bearing? Is it something it's in the design? And if we were to redesign the EFCC today, what are some of the elements we put in place to ensure that it gets its teeth back and that it can become that effective anti-corruption agency that we need in the country today?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at a longer paper that I wrote a few years ago, which was based on very extensive fieldwork and interviews with the EFCC, ICPC, the CCB, it's called Innovative or Ineffective, and basically, asks this question, you know, have these agencies been sort of progressively failing and getting worse? Have they been essentially declawed and become ineffective, or are they just sort of adapting and doing the best that they can in the face of some very significant obstacles? And I talk about those obstacles, the biggest one being that it is extraordinarily difficult to both mount and successfully execute a successful prosecution, grand corruption prosecution in Nigeria. I would also add, if you look, as you have, Patrick, look at how these such prosecutions have fared in the UK, or, for example, the prosecution of individuals related to the OPL 245 case in Italy, or, of course, any type of grand corruption prosecution in the United States, how difficult it is to um, prove predicate crimes were committed, prove there was intent, sort of really overcome what can be an especially powerful set of legal obstacles and a very high judicial bar, sometimes a lack of really sophisticated understanding on the part of the judges that are hearing these cases about the ins and outs of grand corruption and corruption activity. And then also the fact that more often than not, the defendants, the individuals who are being prosecuted, can use their dirty money to afford the best lawyers that money can buy. And that can be both in the Nigerian context can be formidable, because not only can you defend yourself extremely strenuously in court, and essentially outmatch the EFCC prosecutors and so forth, but also potentially compromise, you know, the process, the judicial process in many different ways. So, um, so we know the obstacles. Both there. What I heard from these agencies is that for the most part, the legal tools they have are fit for purpose, but it is really then taking those tools and let's be honest, it's the old, it's like scoring a goal. That's the hardest part. And what we
Yeah.
have seen, of course, good luck, Jonathan, with Alamacia, with Buhari even, is when these high level convictions are secured, then you have the sort of the Trump effect, the magic wand of presidential pardons comes in and undoes sort of, 10 years of extremely difficult, laborious, work in an instant. And that really undermines the agencies. So I think the other key point I would make about the agencies, they get a lot of criticism, and this is legitimate, that they only go after, the opponents of the current regime. They only go after the political enemies of current elites, and that those who are within the system are untouchable. And I look at that, and this may change based on what we've been talking about in terms of a one-party state. But uh, in the past, these political winds are shifting all the time. And so there have been many opportunities, and the EFCC and the ICPC, and the CCB have taken advantage of them very deftly, very adeptly, in my opinion, to prosecute people, again, who deserve to be prosecuted when they fall out of favor. Now, the problem then, of course, is that these cases take so long. Sometimes people fall out of favor and then they work themselves back into favor. And so it's like a roller coaster. You think you're safe, and then you're back and falling down the.
I
So
think the problem is even worse than that,
yeah.
Matthew. And there's a small study I'm trying to do on this.
Yeah.
We issued a Freedom of Information request to the EFCC to give us their data, going back at least a decade. They responded with, go take whatever you can see from our website. We've gone to their website and they've got data up to like from 2021, thereabouts. And when we look at the data, about 85% of the prosecutions are all 419 cases.
Cybercrime. Yeah.
Yeah, cybercrime, and you've got people like $1,000, $2,000, $10,000. I feel it's an insult. I feel it's an insult on my intelligence that you are the anti-corruption agency for a country where we've lost over $600 billion, from I think it's 1960 or whatever, and the people you can prosecute at least prosecute, forget whether you're able to jail them. People who you've accused of corruption, the little 419 kids, I'm not justifying their act, but you've got governors, you've got PAMSECs, you've got directors, and none of them are on your list, And my question is, what is defective in the design of these anti-corruption institutions that they think that listing 419 kids would be okay to people like us when we look at their performance as an agency?
Yeah, so what I would encourage you and everyone to think of in terms of this like divide, right, between the mass amount of cybercrime or 419, petty 419 convictions and then the grand corruption cases,
Yeah.
is these are almost like two different, you know, sides of their business. Two different divisions. Imagine a business, that I don't know, makes toy cars, and then one side of the business makes actual cars, that
Mhm.
you can drive home. That's really the analogy here. So these cyber, and that was baked into the establishing act of the EFCC. So that, in a sense, is I wouldn't say a flaw, but it's a quirk of its design. It was born, of course, I mean, 419 cybercrime is no less relevant now than it was. But of course, it was born out of that time in 2004, 2003 timeframe earlier, where, that was very front and center in
Yeah,
terms of a problem that needed essentially an agency where it could be domiciled that could go after it.
yeah,
So it was a bit of a marriage of convenience and sort of an awkward Frankenstein's monster of being sewed together, these two parts of the business, EFCC. And of course, you also have the quirk of ICPC, right? Really, its remit being very narrowly focused on civil servants or government figures. You have another quirk, right, of CCB, having again a very narrow remit, and part of that is sort of the general problem of Nigerian government agency creation, where CCB was created first, then ICPC, then EFCC, and rather than sort of subsuming their roles together, why have one agency doing something when you can have three? Because then you can, appoint three executive chairmen, and instead of just one. So the point, as you rightly highlight, is that there is this disconnect where the EFCC will put out a headline saying, "Oh, we've secured 1,000 convictions in 2025 or 2,000 convictions. Bravo to us." And don't get me wrong. I mean, they do secure those convictions for for the lesser crimes. Often they are essentially plea bargains. They get this Yahoo boy, in the cell. They twist his arm and say, admit to this, and you can get off with this sentence. So they're good at securing those small convictions. But then there's a much more difficult set of mountains to climb, which are these high profile corruption cases. And those will always be extraordinarily challenging and difficult, and let's be honest, prone to failure. Both in terms of the fact that the EFCC, for a variety of reasons, has not put its best case forward, not done as well as it could have prosecuting it, but also, even if it had done so, just facing so many potential obstacles and missteps along the way that favor those who, the kleptocrats in power. So I think it's okay to sort of really be able to articulate why the FCC needs to be strengthened and how it's failed, but not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and sort of beat up on it too badly, because I think that in a lot of ways it is proceeding in good faith. The people who work there are, we want to view them as sort of politicized and political cronies, but I think in reality they are just very pragmatic and they understand they operate in a political environment. And so they try their best to sort of adapt around that reality in ways that will facilitate them getting high profile corruption
Sure.
convictions.
Let me see if I can get through so many. We've got a number of questions
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
Q&A tab. Let me see if I can get through some of them. There's one from Omar Muhammad. He runs next year in Liberia, and the question is where the pressure for good governance will come from. The political class always elevates the play acting of democracy just enough to sustain hope and blunt agitation, while the fundamentals stay intact. The middle class lacks the cohesion and numbers to force systemic change. Those who can japa, that is, leave the country, have left. Those who stay carve out protected niches and look away. So, where is the real entry point for catalytic reform in Nigeria? Where do we start? Where can we start?
Oh, this is an excellent question, Umar. And yeah, kind of what Patrick and I were talking about before the camera started rolling, and something that we touched on a little bit earlier, talking about the collective action problem, the different incentives that these elite incentives. There's, as you rightly articulate, the middle class sort of looking to sort of not lose, not risk what they've sort of put together to potentially cushion themselves from the headwinds, political headwinds that are blowing. And then, of course, the fact that you don't necessarily have the ingredients in place to facilitate not an uprising is the wrong word, but like sort of a bottom up movement. Now, what we have seen, of course, in the past, I'm thinking, the 2012 fuel subsidy protests or the End SARS protests. You have had these moments where there's been a greater than average um, sort of popular mobilization around a political issue, sometimes a very narrow one as well. And in those moments, we've seen, governments really take two different approaches. I think in 2012 it was more of a co-optation, sort of buying off people to get them to go away, and then in then SARS protests more of a coercive crackdown type of approach. I think the Nigeria's ruling elites are willing to use both. So from a point of view of finding a catalytic entry point, I think it's very difficult, and I'm not sure I can see one, in the near future. I think it does hinge on this sort of reordering of the political space in response to sort of changing demographic and economic realities. So, in other words, I don't see change happening in the short to medium term, but I think you can begin to sketch out how some broader tectonic shifts over the long term. So maybe we're talking like 6 to 10 years out could create those type of openings. And I think it comes with, that sort of magic, right, set of ingredients that brings about any sort of historical changes, which is, individuals, particularly powerful or compelling or brave individuals working together, sort of a set of socioeconomic factors, and also I think an ebbing of power among the traditional elite.
Mhm.
Um, but I know that's an unsatisfying answer to a very difficult question.
I have a question from Professor Richard Joseph. And it's in an era of transactional geopolitics. What's the implications for a country like Nigeria that's so steeped in transactional politics?
Yeah, that's interesting, Prof. Great to have you on. I think actually, Patrick, your ears must have been ringing because Patrick and I, when we spoke a few weeks ago, were talking about you and singing your praises. So it's nice to have a mentor and friend on the call as well. Transactions, yes. I mean, I wrote a piece for Chatham House a week ago talking about this exactly within the context of the Nigerian elites response to Trump's threats to Nigeria, threats to invade, bomb Nigeria, and I made the case, and some may disagree that I think this, in a sense, played to the strengths of these transactional political approaches that Nigerian elites rely on to sort of keep the current system operating the way it does. And so they essentially, you know, Trump's approach resonated with them, and they were able to sort of employ, I think, some of those transactional tricks, if you call them that, in the way in which they sort of responded to the U.S. threats and turned them around a little bit in order to gain something in return. Now the question is, where does that road lead to? We saw today that 200 military trainers and advisors are deploying. U.S. troops are deploying to Nigeria to undertake that type of cooperation. In the past, that type of cooperation has created a little maybe hate and discontent within the Nigerian army. So I don't necessarily see the presence of 200 U.S. trainers necessarily increasing, necessarily being the part of the transaction that the Nigerian government wanted or the Nigerian military wanted out of this. But it's something that shows that they are fully immersed in playing the game with the U.S. So I do think that you know it is fundamental, Prof, as you sort of intimate there, to really understand transactionalism, transactions, these quid pro quos, when looking at Nigerian politics, both at the federal level and the state level, and also um, understanding why obviously Nigerians are so dissatisfied with the type of governance they have because the transactions in many cases, right, are excluding them. They're not getting anything, whether it be public goods or in many cases even those private goods, out of that relationship with government. So some have opted out, and some may be looking to essentially, um, uh, you know, reapproach their relationship with government and reforge those transactions in different ways.
Thank you. I have a question from Caleb Obonna. He says, it looks like there's an elite consensus in Nigeria and a death of the common consensus of the protesters and masses, owing to the underlying cancer of tribalism and religious bigotry. Do you think a structural change to the system of governance or administration in the country, moving it to more regional autonomy, almost similar to what we had in the early post-independence era, could bring about a cohesive form of development? Is it possible that tribalism could yield the sort of competition amongst regions that could make Nigeria advance beyond its present level, where its potentials are stale and progress stagnant?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. That's a very good question. And actually, it's one that sort of, again, before the call, Patrick and I were talking about local politics here in my small town and how, uh, so much can be achieved by focusing locally and not pinning one's hopes on sort of the federal government to come to the rescue. And in dysfunctional states, right now, the U.S. is highly entering a period of sort of high dysfunctionality. Regardless of your politics, just the government itself is not functioning the way it has and carrying out its basic functioning. It's really fraying in terms of just providing those basic public goods and services. So in a way, you know, I was telling Patrick that, in a way, my reaction to that was saying, well, okay, we can't change these outcomes at the federal level. Let's focus on what's more achievable at the state and local level. Um, and traditionally in Nigeria, right, those have been very vestigial functions because of that period of military rule and the period of state creation where you created these civil service states. But I take your point. It's very valid that this or prior to that, there were these regional governments, that really did function. One could argue yeah, they functioned at a far higher level than the federal government functions now in many ways. And so I think a return to a decentralization of power, and I think this is coming, as sort of oil revenues, become less of a centrifugal, a pulling together of the wealth, and wealth becomes much more localized, and maybe not on the same scale as, of course, petroleum wealth, but still sort of enough to provide a social contract. Because what will happen when the petroleum wealth goes away, is that people are going to have to pay tax, and they're going to expect public services in return, and not just like, middle class people paying tax, but like everybody paying tax, and everybody feeling like they have skin in the game, even if it's in their local community, even if it's not money that they're paying in tax, it's time and resources, and banding together to undertake, to repair a bridge, or dig a culvert or what have you in the village. These are things that sort of bring people together and bring a sense of common purpose. And so I think that, yes, the decentralization of government functions and will be extraordinarily healthy, um, for Nigeria. And it may, I don't know if it would necessarily widen, you know, inter-regional divides. I mean, because I think those are already, fairly well established. I don't think, I don't know, the fault line between, I don't know, uh, Cross River State and Akwa Ibom State will widen because, more is happening at the state and local level in those states. I think if anything, you can argue that, like in the United States or other federalized, you know, countries, sometimes those sub-regional alliances or partnerships form because there is now a sort of benefit to doing that, whether it be economic, I mean, it's going to be primarily economic, but maybe social and cultural as well, those ties, rather than those two states, again, viewing the apportionment of federally provided resources in a zero-sum way.
Yeah, just see if we can get a few more questions in. There's one from Chibike Mbahurike. He's from CDD West Africa, and he has an interesting question here. Would you consider election rigging another form of civilian coup against democracy in West Africa?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, I think that, an election that is rigged so, egregiously, right? I mean, yeah, maybe we're talking, I mean, certainly electoral coups do happen. That's, there are political scientists who study electoral coups, in those terms. And so that's a whole separate phenomenon. I think that, yeah, there's electoral rigging on a scale of 1 to 100. And I
Hmm.
think that in the case of Nigeria, that number has fluctuated across space and time. Um, I always like to point out the post 1999 elections, and state elections in places like, I don't know, Bielsa, where, voter turnout was 106% of the registered voters in the state. So we've come a long way, and the fact that actually, now we talk about, oh, voter turnout is so low, there's this, real disinterest among Nigerians to engage in the electoral process. I think part of that disinterest was already there. It's just that the elections were so badly rigged early on, right, that they could during the Obasanjo period especially, and then with 2007 being the low water mark,
Yeah,
really just votes were just being written in.
yeah,
And again, if I was sitting there drinking my beer, advising the local PDP guys what numbers to write in, I would have reminded them that it was probably more realistic to write in a number that was 50% of the voter turnout rather than 105% of the voter turnout if they didn't want things to smell fishy right off the bat. So
yeah,
I do believe that electoral rigging can reach the point that it is really a true coup where you are seizing power and disrupting the system and really undertaking what would in any other context be an unconstitutional change of government. But I think that Nigeria is not anywhere near that point yet.
yeah, yeah. Let me get this other question in. Is from, I'm combining a question from Joy Ogaji and Chibuike, and it's all around with elections now almost entirely eroded and devoid of integrity. How do we now reclaim what is left of our democracy? And Joy builds on that to say, is there anything the citizens can do to ensure the country reverts to the path of progress, since our votes no longer count?
Yeah, I mean, one thing again, this goes back to just my own personal experience here in my local government area, my town, my village, is to get. I think Patrick, you and I talked about this earlier, to get involved in local politics. Uh, if all of us who were busy tweeting or writing op-eds about the death of democracy in Nigeria were spending that time, um, putting our time and effort and resources into uh, our home place and being engaged in politics locally with groups of like-minded people, um, I think we would create these centers of gravity where not only could that potentially lead to better governance, you know, but also calls for electoral integrity in local and state elections.
Yeah.
Because as we know, the focus is on these federal elections, we're focused on this, that, or the other. And meanwhile, right, elections are, what are they? Are they about to happen, Patrick, in federal capital territory, local
Yes,
elections?
local
You know,
elections.
yeah, exactly. And everyone's like, no one gives that the time of day. So, Patrick, earlier we were talking about your friend who had mounted a run for governor. We all know people,
Lagos. Hmm.
yeah, extremely talented people who've run for offices, federal offices, high state levels offices. Those people should be running for local government chairman. Those people should be running for or looking to serve in state government in some sort of capacity, state house of assembly. Now, don't get me wrong, that is probably in the current environment a very demoralizing and difficult position to be in, but the potential for change in how the system operates and how elections operate happens from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of going back to Umar's question, I believe earlier about sort of what's the catalytic entry point.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm naive in believing that, but I think that it's for the most part been completely untried.
Yeah.
All of us, who like to talk, get into the talking shops and talk, we should be getting engaged and doing the hard, not romantic at all, difficult grunt work of forming local political action committees, local parties, what have you, and delivering better results for people in the towns and villages out there and work our way
Let me
up.
get let me get this last question in, from someone who's highly talented and who has also gone back to local politics, former Minister Frank Mweke Jr. And he ran for governor, in the last dispensation. Is there anything in your studies of the different aspects of Nigeria's politics and the conduct of its political elite that may appear to predispose it to the risk of eventual disintegration?
That's a very, very good question. Um, no, I mean, I think disintegration, is a pretty distant prospect at this point. But I think that, down the line, and hopefully these come in a very sort of orderly, consensual fashion, there may be constitutional, changes down the line that, again, hopefully provide more local autonomy. I mean, there's talk obviously of state policing. Traditionally, I had been very skeptical, of that over the years and seen the path to police reform, for example, leading through sort of the professionalization of the federal police force. I've become a lot more, open to the notion that it wouldn't hurt to, have state police forces. We essentially have those already. Again, this notion that if the police are more directly beholden to the people and are their friends and neighbors, I think that prospect is actually maybe a positive one, and certainly one that works in other countries, both developed and developing around the world. But no, I am optimistic about Nigeria, and this is sort of maybe a good way to end, Patrick, and addresses Frank's question, which is, you know, uh, as much as we've been talking about the dysfunction, I think we've also highlighted, all these very hopeful signs and
Yeah.
centers of gravity that exist, and hopefully given a clear call to action that there's potential to push back against the excesses of the system, or at least sort of call it for what it is. Because again, that goes back to the illusions of governance, the Potemkin village, if you will, the emperor having no clothes but really wanting to be seen to have clothes.
Hmm.
As long as we keep pointing at the emperor and reminding him that he has no clothes, there is hope for forging something more constructive and more hopeful going forward.
My absolute last question. Understanding kleptocracy, just a few words on what the book is about and when we can expect to have it in our hands.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for giving me a quick. I'll give you the quick sort of 30-second elevator pitch, which is understanding kleptocracy is a comparative look at ultra corrupt regimes worldwide. It's not a Nigeria book, actually. I mean, Nigeria, of course, gets a few colorful mentions here and there, but actually, it's the focus is much broader and looks at the fact that ultra corrupt. What's interesting about ultra corrupt regimes is not so much what they share in common, but actually what sets them apart from one another. And we should be looking at these kleptocracies, as I argue they are, really there are the many different species of them, many different types, and it's really important to understand, just like we've been talking about today, how they really work, how the system functions, rather than talking about them in general terms or just using the word kleptocracy to describe regimes that we don't like and think are bad.
Hmm. Hmm. So, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, we've spent the day talking about corruption as an operating system. If there's one takeaway for me, it's that institutions don't fail at random. They fail in patterned ways through incentives, elite bargains, and selective enforcement. And if that's true, then reform is not just moral outrage. It can be redesigned and, changing what is rewarded, what is punished, and what can no longer be hidden. If it was designed and it's functioning the way it is, we can also redesign it to function the way we want it to. I'm Patrick Okibo. Thanks for listening to Development Discourse. Let's keep building that society we want to live in. Thank you, Matthew, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.